Hello there, and welcome. This is Matt Petrowski. We are learning more about FileMaker in this video. Thank you for stopping by. If this is your first video, this is part of a series. You can watch the other videos, and you're going to get a lot of content here about FileMaker. As I stated, my name is Matt Petrowski. I'm an editor over at a website that I produce called ISO FileMaker Magazine, or just FileMaker Magazine for short. In today's video, we are taking a look at manage containers. So let's jump into the content so you can learn more about FileMaker Pro. So I'll switch my video. If you catch me looking off to the side, it's because I'm using a control system in order to switch my videos and see what's going on. FileMaker Pro, we have been going through a series where I'm teaching you about the environment. If you've watched the other videos, then you're probably aware that that's what we're talking about. We're talking about this area of FileMaker Manage. It's basically where you set up the whole of your FileMaker database. Of course, there's tons of other tools in all of the other menus, but today we are looking at this one particular item of containers. Now, containers, all the rest of the fields are pretty much obvious. Ones that may be a little more difficult are calculations. We'll be getting into those, and then summary fields, but text, numbers, dates, times, simple, right? Containers are a little bit of a different topic because you really sort of have to plan things out when it comes to containers. So if you're following along in this video and you're a newer FileMaker user, even if you're intermediate, I suggest that you choose this option right here of a new solution in your copy of FileMaker. I'm going to create this on the desktop. Let me bring that window on screen. Actually, I have a folder that I've created called containers, and I'm just going to name this, the name of this file, just super simple, of containers. Now, if you have heard anything about this word blob, of binary large object, maybe that's dating me and that goes way back. You can look it up on Wikipedia. It stands for binary large object, or basically just things that you throw into the database that aren't distinct little pieces of data like text or numbers. So in FileMaker, they call these containers, and obviously I just created a new FileMaker database, and the very first thing came up was manage database. We're used to manage database. If you took a look at the previous video I shot about that. And as I stated, all of the rest of these are pretty obvious, and we're going to be going through all of the different fields and their settings in another video. But since we're taking a look at the environment, we have to deal with containers when we're dealing with the manage containers. So choosing a container type of field right here for what we're going to make. And again, I'm just going to call this field container. It's all container, container, container. We'll get to naming your fields in another video, as I stated. So we'll create that container because we're going to need that container in order to deal with the manage containers. Now, managing containers is broken down into two parts. The first part is telling FileMaker, or telling this particular file, I should say, how do we want to, or not how, or where are we going to store container data if we want to store it outside of the file. That's area number one. Area number two is on each individual container field, we get the option. We get to choose, just like life. Do we want to store this data inside the file, or do we want to store it outside of the file? So that's what we're going to be looking at. So we created this field first just because we know that that's part two that's going to be coming up after we establish the manage containers. Now, the one thing that we're going to do in this video is we're going to want to actually look at where things are actually stored. In order to do that, I'm going to show the Finder window here, my containers, and we'll have that side by side so that we can actually watch what happens. Now, when you upload a FileMaker file to be hosted by FileMaker server, that's going to, the containers or where the file is stored can be managed on server. There can be one level of subfolders, but when it comes to the container data, any of these things that you're putting into containers, probably images are what you're probably most commonly thinking of, but you can also store files, Excel files, Word files, whatever files you want. You can store those either in the file, as I stated, or relative to the file. So let's take a look at what I'm talking about. Quit talking and just get to it, Matt. All right, here under Manage Containers, when we make the selection and FileMaker brings up the dialog box, FileMaker by default creates one item for us. Again, FileMaker is trying to be easy and nice to use for us, but it doesn't always make sense to our solution. Now, as we're going to see, we can see right over here, I have the Finder, or a portion of the Finder window actually revealed right here. It won't show up right away. We'll need to put an image file in there, but I don't like FileMaker's default. Now, I don't have to delete it if I don't want to. Of course, these buttons, I don't need to explain them to you. I can edit this, and it's the same thing as if I had clicked New. If I clicked New, same dialog box. So since FileMaker already gives us one, we can basically use it, and we can decide whether we want to have multiple different locations, and we'll discuss where and how this becomes important. So I'm going to double click this, same as clicking Edit, and I'm going to just call this Images for right now. Now, Images is pretty generic. It's just images. The important thing to remember is that you have two different places where you're going to get to specify how many folders deep this content is actually stored if you're storing it outside of the file. Always remember you have the option to simply just store all of the data that you load into containers, images, files, what have you, directly within the file. The downside to that might be that you could experience some corruption if the file became corrupted. Now, if you're running a good backup strategy, then you're really not worried about that too much. But these paths are what determine the subfolders where items are stored. So you can see right here that we have this very clear, we learned about this in the previous video when we were talking about the managing external data sources. These paths are a little bit different. We don't have those prefixes where that one had file or FileWin or FileMac. This one basically just has the directory that you're going to actually store things in. Now, a key term to recognize is this one, base directory. The base directory means this is the larger directory, not the larger directory, but the overarching directory where you can store all of the container data within. Then you can specify on a field by field basis what subfolders you want that data to go within. So you can break this up in a bunch of different ways because you can have multiple base directories. In fact, we'll do that. We'll create one called images, and then we'll create another one, a new one called people for some reason. And one thing to remember is that you do need that trailing slash as it shows right here. On each of these examples, you're going to need that trailing slash, and you're going to say, okay. So we have two base directories now that we can potentially store this binary data. We click OK, and this is part one of the two parts. Before we actually click OK, let's take a look at this thumbnails option right here. The thumbnails option is something that helps you along with regards to performance when you are storing things externally. And you'll notice that the message right here that says that to improve performance, image thumbnails are generated and transferred over the network when you access large images. Now, the key here is large images. You don't get to really determine what a large image is or isn't. FileMaker sort of does that for you and wants to make things easy and take care of it. But we don't have a setting in here that says, okay, if the image is over 1 megabyte, then actually generate and store the thumbnails. If the image is over 5 megabytes. So really what happens is from FileMaker server, it makes its own determination without us having control in terms of whether it's going to transfer a whole image or whether it's going to transfer just a thumbnail. I don't actually know what that number is. I probably would be interested to look that up, and it might be on FileMaker's technical specifications, or maybe one of the engineers might tell me. But we have two options for this. We have the generate and store thumbnails for images. We can turn this off, and if we do turn this off, this means that no matter what, that externally stored image, when a user is looking at the database, and the database shows a record, and that record has a container, and the container has an image that it needs to show. With this unchecked, it's going to show and load the whole data. So if it's a 5 megabyte file, it's going to load all of that 5 megabytes. If I turn this on, I have two sub options of permanent storage and temporary storage. Now, temporary storage means that as the user has opened the database and they've gone through records, they look at records with those container fields, and it's just like we talked about in one of the previous videos. It's sort of like we have a cache. It's a bowl of fruit that is on the table, and as fruit comes into that bowl, any new fruit that comes in, as it gets pushed down, the older fruit gets pushed out. That's how the cache works. There's a fixed amount of space. So if you look at 20 images, and the 21st image says, well, I've run out of cache space, that comes in and it replaces, and the older one gets pushed out of the cache. Now that's temporary storage, and that means that when the FileMaker client is closed down, then all of those thumbnails sort of go away. They will need to be reloaded the next time that a copy of FileMaker is opened and you connect to that file. Whereas permanent storage will attempt to permanently store those thumbnails in the cache on the computer. If you go to another computer, then that cache isn't the same on a different computer because maybe you looked at different images there. So you can play with these in terms of performance of what you want to achieve. Again, these thumbnails are generated by FileMaker and you have really no control over them. So that's pretty much all there is in the Manage Container dialog box proper. That's all there is. We can define our base locations and what happens with regards to thumbnails. Now that we've accomplished part one of the two, we can go to the second part of the equation, which is going to be controlling on the individual fields and deciding, do I want this field to store its data inside the database file itself, or do I want it to store it outside of the database file using these external storage containers? So again, if you're taking really high resolution images, let's say medical scans, or let's say super high resolution images for a realty database, you probably will get a little bit better performance if you store these outside. But we will have a downside, which we'll talk about here, with regards to transferring this file. So let's go into the second area. We need to go back into Manage Database now, where we first were at the very beginning. And we are at Manage Database. There we go, Matt. And now we take a look at part two of the two parts with regards to this Manage Containers. With this container field selected, it's down here in the options that we're going to need to click. And when we click on the options for this field, as we will see here, and I'll back this off a little bit, we have this right down here where it says container. Store this container data externally. So again, this is where you get control. If these high resolution medical scans or realty pictures of a house, if you want to store these specifically outside of the database, then this is where you would check this box to store them externally. Now here's where you get to choose those base paths. So these are the different folders, the main folders that we have options to. Now images, again, is really pretty generic. Whereas, let's say customer images, or if you're running, let's say, a pet database and you want to take pictures of pet haircuts, I don't know, whatever it is, that first folder name is what you're going to have access to, but now you have access to specify subfolders within that. So here's a key thing to recognize, something that I've done quite frequently. If you choose this second option of open storage, what that's going to do is it's going to create a subfolder of where this particular image is going to be stored. So you can see right here that I have access to this specify button. The specify button in FileMaker, anytime that you see it, is going to mean FileMaker's calculation dialog box. And we're going to have a future video coming up talking about that. But essentially, I can click right within here and just give it the paths if I want. Or by clicking specify, I can actually get really tricky and use FileMaker's calculation dialog box. Now I could do some really random things here, such as using FileMaker's random function, which I highly suggest you don't do. This is something you would never do, but it would be pretty funny to actually set it up to do. Most of the time, what you can do is you can have FileMaker create subfolders based on data within your database. So one of the things that we're going to learn in this series is that using a primary key, something that is absolutely unique and identifiable to a particular person, that can be part of the naming of the subfolders in terms of how the images actually get stored. What's really nice is it makes it sort of cool if you're going to use other technologies in order to reference those images. Now you have to be really careful because you may want to just reference them, and I'm speaking about PHP or something to that effect, super advanced stuff that you'll get to much later, provided you're doing it on the same server. But one thing you want to know is anytime that FileMaker is managing something or FileMaker server, you really don't want to do much, if any, manipulation of that data with any other technologies. Although it is possible, and that's why I'm bringing it to your attention. So here I might have something like the ID of the name of the subfolder that I want this data to actually go in. I'm just going to call it pics right here. And I'll just give it those quotes. Now I believe, yeah, we do need that trailing. So pics, that trailing slash right there. And we'll say okay. And now that we've got that option set, in fact, did you notice right there that the options actually show you that for this particular container, it is using an external storage, and that storage is open, meaning these images are not being encrypted by FileMaker. They're actually just being stored, and that's so that I can control the path location. When I click OK, and I click this dialog right here. Now this dialog is an important one to pay attention to because this is the one that down the road, if we ever want to move this FileMaker file to another server, or we want to download the file and we want to have the image data, then we probably might need to go into that dialog box for that specific field, set it so that the storage is actually internal to the file. Because what that will do is it will move all of the externally stored images into the FileMaker file. Likewise, if we reverse the process, maybe if all of the images are currently stored in containers in the file, it will move them all the way out. So sometimes you need to do this when you're transferring a FileMaker file from one server to another, unless you really know what you're doing or your server administrator knows what they're doing and they are able to transfer all of the images and the file and everything will link back up. Remember, if everything's not in the same file, we've got images that are external, all of the images have to match all of the records. Otherwise, you could have a mismatch or, things fall out of sync. So here we're going to say, yes, we want to transfer. FileMaker will tell us, okay, we've transferred those out, even has a log file, and we will see what happens. If you noticed in the background on the video, a folder called images was created. And over here in my database, if I have one record already, I can see that right there. With this record showing, you can see that when I drag these screenshots that I've taken into this, what's going to happen is FileMaker is going to create that subfolder as it just did, and this all happens on FileMaker server when the file is hosted, and the image is right there. So that's the first of the two sub options that we have. The other one that we saw was secured storage. So let's take a look at that one. We're going to go into the defined database, and I'm going to duplicate this by simply clicking duplicate, and I'll rename this to container 2. Change that, and I'm going to change the options on this particular field. It's going to store, instead of choosing images now, let's choose people, and let's make it secure storage. Now note that you don't have the ability to control a subfolder for secure storage. You really can only choose the base directory. So if you had wanted a subfolder, remember in the manage containers dialog box, we can specify as many subfolders as we want. However many is up to you that makes sense. I suggest you limiting it to pretty much 1, maybe 2. If you start to go 3 deep, you really have to ask yourself, why am I storing the images this far deep? So we're going to choose people here, and we're going to choose secure storage for this container 2. And I'm going to zoom out here, click OK. FileMaker automatically added container 2 for us, It's asking us, do we want to actually make this transfer? Yes, we do. We can see in the background, the folder, what happened is FileMaker created that base directory of people, and with this expanded, we can now drag an image in here. Notice that FileMaker has created a secure folder, which ends up being 98, 86, F94, F04, 76, and we finally get down to the image. Now, this is not the same all the time. This is all the encryption that FileMaker uses. So all of these numbers and all of these subfolders will all be completely random, and on server, that's when you get into a situation where, unless you absolutely know what you're going to do, if I downloaded this file from FileMaker server or asked for it, and I'm using external container storage, if the externally stored data is not taken along with the file to the new server or moved with it, you won't have access to your data. The container will actually show that it's missing the image. And as long as things don't change, you can then move the folder and things will get back in sync. But here's my suggestion for if you want to move this actual file. This is something a lot of FileMaker developers will do. It's a really simple step. You just, when you're working on the file and you know I'm going to transfer this file to another computer, and again, it really depends on how many large resolution files or images or stored data that you have in containers. It really depends whether you want to make this step. But if it's not too painful, then what you can do is go into the defined database, simply double-click on the field to access its options, or click the options, and then actually just uncheck this box of store container data externally. You click OK, and as soon as you get out of this dialog box, FileMaker now gives you that container transfer option. So what happens is all of the data, you can see that in the background, that whole secured folder completely went away, and all of the data was moved back into the FileMaker file. We can see that it completed, it did it successfully. We get the little check mark. We could open the log and look to see if there were issues with images being transferred, and we say OK. Now this file can be downloaded from FileMaker server, put onto another FileMaker server, and then you could go check that box, and it'll push them right out and be secured again. So there are other options that you have that you can set on the file itself so that the file itself can be secured, because right now the file is not necessarily secured. That's an advanced topic that we can take a look at with developer tools at another time with another video. For right now, if you have any questions with regards to containers and managing that data, if you want to put those into the chat, I'll be able to answer those. We're coming up on 22 minutes. I'm trying to rack my brain and think if there's anything else that I've glossed over with regards to containers. I think with regards to the managed containers and how it impacts individual containers, we talked about secure, we talked about the open storage and where you get to specify the subfolders. Really, when it comes to containers, if you want to, when you're programming with FileMaker and you really want to know as you're programming whether that container data is stored externally or whether it's stored in the file, let's take a look at the functions that you have access to. We will open up, we'll actually just go into, since I can't assume that everybody's got a copy of developer, although you should if you're going to be a serious FileMaker developer. I'm going to create a field called container data, or let's call it more appropriately container info. Now I'm going to make this a calculation field, which we haven't taken a look at in this series, the whole defining of fields. I'll create this, but of course we need the calculation, we need it to be a calculation field if we're going to do any calculations. Let's take a look. Let's see if this will show us all of our container functions. There we go. This is what I'm looking at. I just simply made a selection here, and I'm going specifically to container functions. Now we have a lot of them, but the one in particular that we're going to be looking at is this one, get container attribute. So however you've chosen to store the data, if while you're programming you need to determine whether that data is stored externally, you can use this one function right here of get container attribute. And if we specify the source field by simply applying that, we'd have to look up the documentation to see what does this attribute name expect. Well, I happen to know that there is an attribute called all. I want you to give me all of the data about this. Storage would probably be another one, but we're going to click OK, and then we're going to zoom out, and we've got our container data here, and let's see if we can zoom this out and see what it's going to tell me. Go ahead, save those changes, FileMaker. It's giving me a long number right there. You know, this is a great opportunity to address this. If you are new with FileMaker and you've gotten to this situation where you are seeing this particular exact thing happening on fields that are displaying a lot of data, and you get this, what the heck is this, is scientific notation. You click into the field, well, all your data is right there. Let me show you where you can control that. In layout mode, let's go into layout mode. With that particular layout object selected, you're going to need to show the inspector, and you're going to want to go to this fourth area in the inspector tab. And way down at the bottom, as I close all of these, FileMaker's got this option right here of data formatting. So this data formatting, you're going to see that FileMaker by default, thank you FileMaker for making things so easy for me that you try to format the data for me. You have to switch this from general to as entered. If you want the data to display when you're getting those odd numbers, this is the way that you control that. So if I choose as entered, meaning as the user had entered it, despite the fact that it's a calculation and FileMaker is actually calculating it, when we go into browse mode, we're going to actually see all of that data and not the scientific notation. So there we can see all of the information about this particular container data. That's because I specified the all flag. So all is going to give you all of these different subcategories, the general and then the image specific data, or if it's a file, it'll give you file specific data. But you can see right here that it is telling us that the storage type is external and open on this particular file. And of course, you can specify, I just want general data. I want the image data. That's what you would put in quotes instead of that all. You would put all of these different individual settings, and you can get just this one setting. You may need to parse the text, but ultimately you're able to find out, okay, is this container actually stored externally or not? And then write a script that does something based on that. So that's a good thing to know, is that you have all of these different container functions. Of course, we'll be going through container functions and many other functions in a lot of the different videos in this series. So I think that's going to give us a pretty good wrap. We're at 27 minutes here, and I think I've done a good job of covering the manage containers that we have available to us in the manage area. Manage containers, just remember, you control all of your base settings and your thumbnails in the dialog, and then for each individual field, you control that within the manage database. So let's check over with our questions, see if we've got any that came in here. Hi there, Lee. It looks like I've got a subscriber that's been subscribing to my magazine site for a long time. Lee, how you doing? Glad to know we've got people watching live. Let's see, it looks like there are 16 people on the stream right now. And currently we don't have any questions, at least those coming in for chat with regards to containers. So I guess that means I either did a good job, or if you have a question that's going to come a little bit later, go ahead and put that in the comments down below. Also, if you're interested in being notified about these videos, there's two ways to go about that. You can put them, and a new question came in, I'll get to that. You can click on the little subscribe button on YouTube, and you can put the little bell, click the little bell to get notified. If you do that and you use the mobile application, it's really pretty nice. It'll come up with notices and let you know when I'm going to start a stream, and then you'll be able to ask questions while I'm doing the stream. Otherwise, you can watch after the fact. The other place where you can actually get information is, as I switch here, you can always go over to, and let me show you this, you can always go to my website at filemakermagazine.com, and you're going to find more articles intermediate, advanced content all over the place. There's also this little, as of the recording of this video, if this is still here when you're watching this, you can click on this link or this little image and you can sign up to be notified, and I'm sending out emails to people to be notified about those. So we had one other question that came in, it looks like. And let's see, that came in from Jeffrey. I created a container named Notes. I copied and pasted information from a website into a number of records. When I reopened the file, the information was not there. What type of items can be put into a container? Anything that is a file. Now, it is possible to put text data within a container field, but the way that FileMaker is going to handle it isn't necessarily the way that you would expect FileMaker to handle that data. In a future video, we're going to be taking a look at fields, their settings, their options, indexing, and how that works. But when it comes to notes, notes would typically be in just a standard text field. Let me switch here to the desktop. So if I was creating a field called notes in my FileMaker database, I would simply leave it as a text field right there for notes. You'll have to probably tell me, and you can email me at editor@filemakermagazine.com. In fact, I try my best to get to questions that are sent to that email address. If you have a question, please, and you're watching these videos, send it on in because it gives me information that I need to address about people who have questions who are learning FileMaker Pro. So notes would typically be a text field. And I really can't think of too many times where I've actually used a container field for the purpose of storing textual data. Now, there are cases where if you have a text file, that file needs to serve as a whole, then yes, you can certainly do that. In fact, here's an example of that. We have our database here, and I'm just going to open up the text edit application. It's the standard editing application on the Macintosh. And I will create a new document here on my desktop, and we'll say that this is some type of PR piece of content. I'll say, welcome to this PDF. And what we'll do is we'll apply some formatting. So we'll make this, really large text, and then we'll make some smaller text here. And this basically serves as a template, let's say, for a marketing department to actually use. And I'm going to save this file. Now, this particular application allows me to save either as a rich text document or an HTML document, docx, any of these settings for this document. If I saved it as a plain text with a .txt, if I save it as a web page as .html, it really doesn't matter what the format of the file is. If the file or the text content needs to stay as a whole, and you want to store that into your FileMaker database, that's when you're going to use a container. If you just want to enter in some textual data within FileMaker, that's when you're going to use a text field. So I'll just call this marketing right here and put it, RTF stands for rich text format. If you don't know, we'll create a new record over here, and we'll go over to my desktop where that was stored, and we'll just drag that into FileMaker. So that RTF document that needed to be stored as a whole document, meaning I want to be able to either edit this and put it back into FileMaker, or export it and send it to somebody else, or export it and attach it to an email. That's how and when I'm going to store that text data, even if it's a plain text file. And I hope that answers the question there. Whereas with general notes, I'm just going to type those directly into the field as such. And there I'm able to have returns and all kinds of stuff. And always remember, FileMaker's regular text field does support styles within the actual field. So this particular text field, if I want to make some bold text, just like I did in that separate document, I can turn on this little toolbar right here, the show or hide formatting, and I get access to all of the same formatting option. I can make text bold, and I can make it 36 points, sort of just like we did. And let me very quickly make this a little bit larger so we can see what's going on here. But I have full style control within a FileMaker field, so the distinction of when you use a container field versus a regular text field really depends on what do you want to do with this content. It's very difficult, or it's not impossible, for me to actually export this text, have FileMaker create an external file, and make that be something that I could attach to email or send somewhere. Whereas this is a little bit easier to manage, and FileMaker has script steps where we can actually add a button right next to this that would say edit. And when we want to edit this, what FileMaker would do is it would export this marketing document to a location, open it for us, allow us to edit that, and then save it. But the trick would be getting it back into the container field. That doesn't happen automatically, and we would actually have to script that process. So it's much easier in this scenario to get the file out, do something with it, but then we have to work on getting it back in, and that would be done through a script. So let's see if there's any more questions that we had come in before we actually do a wrap up on this. Eric, learned something again. Perfect. Can you select a folder as a container item as well? Eric, good question. Folders are something I don't believe you can. I have never really put a folder in. You can always test that by simply just dragging in a folder, and I'm pretty sure it won't work here. There we go. It says this file cannot be inserted because it contains other files inside of it. And with FileMaker, you can always actually try that out. My fault, sorry about that. Let me show you what I just did. I was there talking, just going at it. I created a new record here, and I took an untitled folder, dragged that in, and I got this dialog. That's what I was talking about. So sorry about that lack of transition there. If you want to get a group of items together within FileMaker, then the trick that you're going to have to do there is you're going to have to actually compress that. So I'm going to actually compress this with a tool that I have. It's just on the Mac called Clean Archiver, and what it's going to do is it's going to make a zip or a compressed archive of all of that content. Now, because this is a single file, it is something that can be stored within a container field. So again, it really doesn't matter what the file is as long as it's not text data or a folder that contains multiple files. If it's a single file, a Word document, an Excel spreadsheet, a zip compressed archive, RTF, HTML, CSS, JS file, any type of file can go into a FileMaker container field. What you do with that file after the fact is really up to you. Email it, uncompress it, open it, create a system that stores all assets for a design studio, and you put all of your Adobe Acrobat files in here, or excuse me, your Adobe Illustrator and your Adobe Photoshop files. FileMaker will pretty much take anything within the container. All right, so I think that's probably going to give us a wrap for this particular video. I think I've done pretty well with questions. Again, if you're watching this after the fact, you can add your questions down below, and as they will come up, both sides, you're going to have the subscribe on YouTube. You can click on the logo, or you can click on the video for whatever is coming up in the series. So until next time, happy file making.